At the beginning of the 19th century, Spain was a giant with feet of clay. It was no longer the power that made the world tremble. The glory of Felipe II, in that distant 16th century, was just an echo. The empire was rotten from the inside, weakened by a court more concerned with its luxuries than its people. In 1805, the Trafalgar disaster against the British not only sank our ships, it sank our pride in control of the seas. It was the beginning of the end. But the worst happened at home. March 1808. The Aranjuez Mutiny. The people, fed up with betrayal and misery, broke out against Manuel Godoy. The crown was on the ground. Carlos IV, cowed, handed the throne to his son, Fernando VII. A fatal mistake. The weakness of the Bourbons opened the door to the wolf. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had Europe at his feet, was not passing through Portugal. He came to stay. In May 1808, in the Bayonne prison, he humiliated the royal family. He forced them to surrender as if they were chess pieces. Napoleon put his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on a throne that did not belong to him. Spain was, on paper, a French province. But Napoleon did not count on one thing: Spanish pride. On May 2, 1808, Madrid became a slaughterhouse. Knives against bayonets. The people against the best army in the world. The repression was a bloody hell. The executions that Goya painted were not art, they were real carnage. But the fuse was already lit. The War of Independence was not a war of generals, it was a war of hate. Peasants and civilians became ghosts, the guerrilla, an invisible resistance that tore the French to pieces on every corner, on every mountain. Spain was broken. Some wanted the modernity of France, others the return of the absolute king, and in the midst of the ashes, liberalism was born. They were no longer just fighting for a flag, they were fighting for the soul of a nation that refused to die. The war against Napoleon was not a battle of maps, it was a total conflict. In Zaragoza and Girona, the streets became trenches. Men, women and children fought stone by stone, preferring to die under the rubble rather than surrender to the invader. And then, the impossible happened. July 1808. In the fields of Bailén, General Castanos humiliated the imperial eagles. It was the first time the world saw that Napoleon, the master of Europe, could bleed. The myth of his invincibility died on Spanish soil. But while the people died on the front, a dream was born in Cadiz. 1812. Between bombs and sieges, the Constitution was proclaimed. La Pepa. It was a revolutionary cry for freedom. National sovereignty, division of powers, end of absolutism. For a moment, Spain stopped being a fiefdom of kings and became a nation of citizens. However, hope was short-lived. 1814. Napoleon falls, and Ferdinand VII returns. The people called him the Desired One, but what they received was a tyrant. In an unprecedented act of treason, the king tore up the Constitution, restored absolutism and unleashed a witch hunt. The prisons were filled with war heroes who were now called traitors for wanting freedom. Exile or death, that was the destiny of the liberals. But the empire was bleeding from other sides. While the king persecuted his own people, America took advantage of the chaos to break its chains. The crown jewels were lost forever. The tension was unbearable, until in 1820. Commander Rafael del Riego said enough was enough. In Cadiz, the troops that were to go to America rose up against the king. Fernando VII, cowed again, was forced to kiss the constitution that he hated so much. "Let us march frankly, and I first, along the constitutional path," he said cynically. The Liberal Triennium began. 3 years of chaos, divisions and fragility. Spain was no longer just losing land, it was losing its identity. The ancient empire that had dominated the world was falling apart, from within. As Spain sank into its own quarrels, on the other side of the Atlantic, the greatest empire in history fell apart. Napoleon's betrayal and the cowardice of the Bourbons were the spark. In America, they no longer wanted to be subjects of a ruined crown. At first, the government boards claimed to act for the king, but it was a mask. The true cry was only one: independence. 1810. In Mexico, the priest Hidalgo launched the Cry of Dolores, a tide of peasants and indigenous people who rose up against centuries of domination. In the South, names that are legend today began to ride: Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and Bernardo O'Higgins. It was not a clean war. It was a brutal, bloody conflict, where brothers fought against brothers. Entire cities were wiped out by hunger and fire. Spain, ruined and divided, sent soldiers to certain death. 1817. San Martín performs the feat of crossing the Andes and crushes the royal troops in Chacabuco. Chile was free. From the north, Bolívar, the liberator, advanced like a hurricane liberating Venezuela, New Granada and Ecuador. The final nail in the coffin of the empire came in 1824. In the Pampa de la Quinua, the Battle of Ayacucho issued the death knell for Spanish rule in South America. Spain lost its jewels. Only the crumbs remained: Cuba, Puerto Rico and the Philippines. International prestige was on the floor and the economy mortally wounded. But the tragedy did not end there. With the death of Fernando VII, the country did not find peace, it found more war. The fight for the throne between the supporters of Charles, the absolutists, and the liberals of Isabel II, unleashed the Carlist Wars. Spain became accustomed to the sound of rifles in its own villages. Military coups, economic crises and an ideological hatred that would split the country in two for a century. The power that once ruled the world ended the 19th century broken, fragmented and desperately seeking its place in a world that no longer respected it. Decline was not a stage, it had become our reality. After decades of blood and fire, Spain was still lost in a labyrinth of instability. 1843. Isabel II, a girl of barely 13 years old, is declared of legal age. They put a crown on him that was too heavy for a broken country. Spain was not governed by politicians, it was governed by swordsmen. Moderates, progressives and soldiers used the statements as if they were votes. The army no longer protected the borders, it decided who was in charge in Madrid. General Narvaez imposed the moderate decade with an iron fist. Order was maintained based on censorship, full prisons and fear of the wall. But order without freedom is a pressure cooker. Meanwhile, in the mountains of Catalonia and the Basque Country, the ghost of Carlism was still alive, bleeding the resources of a nation that had no respite. 1854. Another blow. O'Donnell and Espartero tried to modernize the country in the Progressive Biennium. They talked about railroads and economic reforms, but hunger and corruption were faster than trains. Spain was left behind. While Europe was filled with factories, we were filled with barricades. The wear and tear was total. The Queen, isolated in a court full of scandals and cliques, lost everyone's support. 1868. La Gloriosa explodes. Generals Prim and Serrano launch a cry that travels throughout the country, "Down with the Bourbons!" Isabel II crosses the border into exile, leaving behind an empty throne and an uncertain future. The revolutionary sexennium began. A desperate search for freedom. The Constitution of 1869 was a ray of light, but the darkness was too dense. General Prim attempted to bring order by bringing in a new king, Amadeus of Savoy. But the destiny of Spain always has a tragic turn. 3 days before the new king set foot in Madrid, Prim, the only man capable of supporting the system, was shot to death on Turco Street. The new regime was born dead, stained with blood and without leadership. While European powers built industrial empires and conquered the future, Spain was still trapped in its own mud, simply fighting, not to disappear. But instability had not yet said its last word. After the fall of the Bourbons, Spain tried to reinvent itself. General Prim, the architect of the revolution, sought a desperate way out by bringing in a foreign king, Amadeus of Savoy. But fate was cruel. Prim was killed before the new king could even shake his hand. Amadeo first found himself alone, in a country that he did not understand and that did not love him. Surrounded by conspiracies and crises, he ended up abdicating in 1873. His farewell phrase said it all: "Spain is ungovernable." And then, the ultimate experiment arrived. The First Republic. It was the first attempt to live without kings, but she was stillborn. Federalists, radicals and monarchists were tearing each other apart for control. Meanwhile, the Carlist Wars continued to bleed the north, and in the south, the cantonal chaos caused cities like Cartagena to declare themselves independent. The country was fragmenting into 1,000 pieces. 4 presidents in just a few months. An uncontrollable disorder that ended as things always ended in that century, with the sound of military boots. January 1874. General Pavia stormed the Congress with his troops. A single coup of authority put an end to the Republican dream. Spain returned to control of the saber. The decline of the Spanish 19th century was no accident, it was a chain of missed opportunities. While the European powers built factories, we built barricades. While the world looked to the future, we remained trapped in the rancor of our own civil wars. Spain was still on the map, but the balance of power had changed forever. We were a historic power, but a tired nation, wounded and divided. This was the century that forged our character, through fire, betrayal and resistance. A history lesson that reminds us that a country that does not know how to unite, is condemned to repeat it. I'm MentorNoriegaIA, and this was The Collapse of the Giant.